Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Health Resources in Action webinar. We are going to wait just one more minute to make sure everybody can get logged on. Welcome, everybody, to Health Resources in Action's webinar on exploring the gender gap in biomedical research funding. Health Resources in Action, or HRIA, is a nonprofit public health institute based in Boston with a mission to help people live healthier lives and create healthy communities through prevention, health promotion, and research. Today we will hear from the Medical Foundation, a division of HRIA, which works with private individuals, bank trusts, and family foundations to design customized grant programs that accelerate medical discoveries. Issues of equity are central to HRIA's work both in public health and medical research, and so we're especially excited to discuss today's topic. Today we welcome Dr. Bob Fege, Vice President of the Medical Foundation Division, to present recently published research on the gap in biomedical startup funding. We're also pleased to have our panelists provide their valuable perspectives on the career trajectory and overall experiences for women in science, as well as the important role of funders in this work. Welcome also to Dr. Karen Freund from Tufts Medical Center and Tufts University Medical School, Dr. Hazel Siv from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the Whitehead Institute, and Dr. Cindy Escobar-Alvarez from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. Before we get started, a few logistical notes. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to participants within the next week. Secondly, we're administering 2 polls during today's webinar to help us understand who is in attendance, as well as people's perceptions of the issue we are discussing. And finally, we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end of today's presentations. Please feel free to submit questions through the webinar interface by going to the Ask a Question section. Now let's get started. First up is Dr. Bob Fege. Dr. Fege is Vice President of the Medical Foundation Division and Professor of Pediatrics at Boston University. He's nationally known for his research on effective health systems approaches to the prevention of violence and abuse. He's a member of the boards of the Massachusetts Children's Trust and Prevent Child Abuse America and of the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Child Abuse and Neglect. He is a graduate of Yale College and received his PhD in biology from MIT and his MD from Harvard Medical School. Prior to joining HRIA, he was the director of the Division of Family and Child Advocacy at Boston Medical Center.
Thanks, Liz. Thank you so much for arranging the webinar. And all of you who are attending, I'm looking forward to a lively discussion today. We'll be discussing disparities in support for new biomedical research faculty members. I'm here, my colleague Lindsay Nykelbub, a grant associate at HRIA, and Sabrina Selk, an epidemiologist at the National Institute for Child Healthcare Quality, helped put this together, and it was recently published in JAMA in September 15th issue. So by way of background, the Medical Foundation was established in 1957. We support health-related philanthropy by conducting peer reviews and grants management. In 2014, 85 investigators received $17.7 million from these philanthropies through 11 award programs that we helped manage. We know that since about the turn of the century, the year 2000, women now receive half of all the biology PhDs and half of the MDs. However, despite that progress early in their training, women are severely underrepresented in more senior parts of their careers. For example, only 30% of NIH-funded investigators are women. Other studies have shown that women scientists have fewer publications than their peers years for men, and they have fewer promotions to tenure. So not only are they slower in getting to full professorship, but actually a smaller proportion of women make it to become full professors. So for those of you, just to quickly review, for those of you who may not be 100% aware of what the trajectory for scientists is, and here I'm using PhDs as an example. When we receive a PhD, typically that program is funded through institutional or federal funds. After completing and defending a thesis, the first thing that happens is most young scientists get a postdoctoral fellowship, and these may last 2 to 4 years. In general, at this point, it's about 8 years since college graduation when one is appointed to the first faculty position. As a scientist, the most important thing is you start off with your faculty presentation earlier so that you start a faculty position with enough money and support to be able to do your grant work so that then you can apply for federal funding. Startup packages are meant to keep faculty members going until extramural funding is available. Typically, the average age for a PhD to receive their first NIH Independent Investigator Award is currently 42 years old. All right, just trying to get to the next slide here. There you go. For this particular study, the Medical Foundation reviewed applicants from 2 early career award programs. We looked at applicants who submitted their applications between 2012 and 2014. Both of these early career award programs focused on individuals who were applying to foundations that funded New England-based investigators. As part of their applications, the applicants were asked to describe the value of their startup packages. In addition, we obtained information about their institutions from the NIH reporter, and all of the statistics I'll be showing you use non-parametric statistical tests. And we use those tests to avoid the problem of having people who either had no funding or a great deal of funding biasing our results. Overall, we looked at 219 applicants, of whom 127 were men and 92 were women. These included 29 MDs, 147 PhDs, and 31 MD PhDs. There were no statistical differences in terminal degree. However, more men than women were basic scientists. Of the 170 applicants in the basic sciences, 108 were men, and conversely, more women were likely to be clinical scientists. 30 of the 49 applicants in clinical investigation were women. We divided the institutions according to their total NIH funding. We divided them into quartiles. The top quartile shows that more men were employed by these institutions, 69 of 109. We also, and I'll be discussing this later, looked at institutions that had more than 10 applications. Excuse me. There were 85 total applications from those institutions, fairly evenly balanced between men and women. Similarly, both men and women had between 7 and 8 years since their terminal degree. When we looked at the value of their startup packages, this graph shows that there was quite an extraordinary difference between men and women. In each group that you can see, men are on the right and women are on the left. So among MDs, the median was about 600,000 for men compared to 475,000 for women. The way the box and whiskers graphs work is the top bar is the highest number. The box itself has the 75th percentile. The bar in the middle is the median or 50th percentile. The bottom of the box is the 25th percentile, and the whisker at the bottom is the lowest value. So here for MDs, you can see that they're roughly equivalent. If you switch over to MD PhDs, although this difference was not statistically significant, you can see that men had nearly $1 million as their median startup packages compared to women who had a median of $500,000. The median for men, in fact, is above the 75th percentile for women. For PhDs, where there were a large number and the difference is statistically significant, again, we see that men had a median startup value of over 900,000 compared to women who had approximately 350,000. And once again, the median for men was higher than the 75th percentile for women. On the far right, you can see that overall our results were quite significant. The median for men was 889,000 compared to 350,000 for women. And I should mention these startup packages are very important. Those are what scientists use to purchase their microscopes or DNA sequencers or any other equipment that they need, or to perform lab renovations so they can do techniques like cell culture or other things that require specialized facilities. This again presents in tabular format and highlights in bold those that were statistically significant. I'm going to the bottom, looking at those institutions that were in the top quartile of NIH funding. In this case, those were institutions that received more than $120 million of NIH funding in fiscal year 14. Men had a median of 1,040,000 compared to 368,000 for women. So what this shows is that in the largest institutions, the difference was greatest. We did this analysis because there was some concern that perhaps men worked at larger, more prestigious institutions than women, and that might explain the difference. But as you can see here, and in the next line, which talks about institutions that had over 10 applicants, the difference for men, the startup package for men was again significantly higher than the startup package for women, with men having a median of 850,000 compared to women who had a median of 483,000. So overall, we also looked just at those individuals who had startups valued at over $1 million, which actually is not such a large amount when you consider the cost of scientific equipment, reagents, and lab renovations. 28% of the applicants had over $1 million in startup funding. However, 40% of men and only 12% of women received over $1 million in startup funding to establish their labs. So in summary, we examined men and women who applied to the same grant award program from the same region of the country, who came from the same institutions, and were roughly the same length of time since their completion of their degrees. And what we found in the sample is that women received less startup support to set up their labs than men. And this difference in many cases was over 2 to 1. For example, in the larger institutions, it was almost 3 to 1, the difference between over $1 million and 368,000. This is obviously only 219 applicants from one region of the country. We need to find out if this is a national trend. There's no reason to expect that it is not, because in general, there's a national or global market for talent, and these young people are quite talented. Assuming it is a national trend, why does this occur, and what changes need to be made to make this more equitable? Because we know as a country, we need to have all of our scientists, all of our talented scientists, have the resources that they need to begin their careers and have an equal shot at obtaining subsequent funding and academic promotion.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Sege. So our next presentation will come from Dr. Karen Freund. We're just going to pull her slides up here. Great. And so Dr. Freund is MD, MPH, is Professor and Vice Chair of Faculty Affairs and Quality Improvement in the Department of Medicine at Tufts Medical Center and Tufts University School of Medicine. She has extensive expertise in mentoring and career development for trainees and junior faculty to become successful clinical investigators, and currently directs several research career development programs. Dr. Freund's own research career has focused on women's health, health disparities, and includes funded work to address the factors associated with a lack of progression of women and underrepresented women in biomedical careers. Welcome, Dr. Freund.
Thank you so much. So, good, okay. I got the slides advanced. So thank you very much, Bob, for inviting me today. And I'm very pleased to talk a little bit about this issue, which I think is of such critical importance. I want to focus my remarks on status on some of the research on advancement of women in academic science careers. Over the course of the last 20 years, NIH has had only one RFA, one program announcement to actually study advancement of women and underrepresented women in academic science careers. And so the research that I'm going to describe was part of that NIH funding. I'm going to talk about two general observations from our longitudinal study. The first is which is that early career support is a strong predictor of subsequent work and subsequent success in career. Second, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges of work-life balance for women and make the observation that these have not been resolved and actually may be worse than they were 15 to 20 years ago. And then secondly, I want to, although there are few interventions to date with clear evidence of institutional success in changing this, I want to talk about a couple of interventions that have been tried and what they have found. So I'm part of a research group that conducted what we call the National Faculty Survey. This is the only longitudinal faculty survey that is representative of the U.S. academic medicine. The original survey conducted a representative sample survey from 24 U.S. medical schools, so about 20% of all medical schools, and was representative of geographic area as well as private and public medical schools. We included both MD and PhD faculty with the goal of looking at issues around advancement of women compared to their male colleagues. So in addition to the quantitative work we did, we've also done some qualitative interviews at various times as part of the study. And I wanted to talk a little bit globally about what some of our findings have been around work-life balance. So there has certainly been an increase in the number of processes and procedures that medical schools have in place for faculty. However, what we found is that many of these, even if there are processes in place to help women when they take medical leave or maternity leave, processes to support child care, many of these processes are not actually put into place and women aren't really using them. We found that women oftentimes do not know what the resources are at their institution. And even more distressing, senior faculty who were responsible within faculty affairs at these institutions didn't even know their own policies. And in one of our studies, when we asked individuals what their policies were and then went to the policies that are listed on their websites, we found that half the time it's just wrong. So there's a lot of challenge, and we're still finding that women have to individually negotiate their own support, their own maternity leave, their own child care arrangements, even in settings where supposedly there are clear policies to make it easier for women to not have to reinvent the wheel and be reliant on the discussions with the person that they report to. The second general area I wanted to talk about was about what we've identified around career advancement after 15 years. So we looked at some of the common metrics that you might consider in considering career advancement: number of grants, number of publications. Did faculty advance in terms of promotion? Did they obtain senior leadership positions? Did their salaries go up? What we found is that when we looked at grants, the grant funding in our sample actually looked similar in numbers between men and women. So accounting for all the other kinds of things that you might account for, that women and men actually had similar levels of grant funding. However, their academic advancement, whether they progressed to associate and then professor, obtaining leadership roles such as division chiefs, center directors, chairs, deans, and their salaries did not advance at the same rate as it did for their male colleagues. So one of the questions that we have raised in our research and have others is, are publications the reason for some of these problems, or are the number of publications on the causal pathway that explain these different, on the causal pathway to understand these differences? So we found that much of the gender differences that we described in these outcomes were explained by relative differences in publication rate. So our research and others have shown that women in general tend to have fewer publications in peer-reviewed journals than men. And so the question is there what are the reasons that women are publishing less? Is it a difference in their understanding of the impact of publications? Does some of this reflect journal bias? It is rare that most journals are blinded to whom the authors are. Does this reflect support in getting papers completed? So I think this speaks some to the issue that we're discussing today in terms of work support and why that initial startup package is so critical in terms of getting work done early, because that early work really predicts whether you're going to succeed, whether you're going to get grant funding. Also, whether this reflects some of the difference in support around home responsibilities. So recent data has shown that even for recent K awardees, that women report much higher home responsibilities, the number of hours of both child care during the week and child and home care responsibilities on the weekends compared to their male counterparts. So I think that this question of whether the publication record really is part of the causal pathway and reflects some of the earlier problems and the earlier challenges that women face is something that requires further investigation. So one of the big questions I think we're hoping to discuss in this webinar is how we can intervene. And I want to just leave for your consideration thinking about this in the framework of the socioecology model that can think about interventions at these various levels, starting in the orange at the individual level to the yellow across the interpersonal level, green institutional and organization levels, the community, and then other structures or systems. And let me give you some examples of what I mean by this. So you can think about the individual level, and you can think about, well, maybe if we train women to be better negotiators and give them negotiating skills, will that solve the problem? Will providing additional support to overcome some of these early career challenges, especially around maternity leave and early child care, will that resolve the problem? Others would consider that maybe this isn't going to be sufficient, that in fact it may not be negotiating skills. Women may be successful at negotiating as far as they can get, and that these differences don't reflect differences in negotiating skills. You could think about it at the interpersonal level, and there's certainly a lot of information now about implicit bias or implicit association, and that training people to understand and recognize that we all bring these implicit biases to every interaction that we have. There is some data that you can actually get people to actually be aware of that, and that it changes people's points of view and the way they make decisions. The data is pretty clear that both men and women implicitly undervalue the activities of women, and in these implicit association tests, both of them will attribute positive things much more quickly to men than they will to women. You could think of this at an institutional organizational level, for example, having departmental oversight on initial packages, on initial startup packages, on initial hires. You could have institutional activities around training, search committees, training on implicit bias that might be required as a way of increasing the awareness of those people who are making these decisions in academic centers. Or at a structural or system level, you could even have something where the NIH or foundations actually decide to take on some role of oversight in the grant process and really have mandated reporting that may change how institutions actually view this and organize this. And certainly the NIH has used their abilities to make a lot of changes institutionally in how research is done by just changing regulations required in order to gain those research dollars. So there have been a couple of interventions that have been done. One that was reported in February this year in Academic Medicine that did a 2.5-hour training with faculty on implicit bias. It didn't show that you could change people's biases on the implicit bias test, but it did show that people had greater personal awareness and that they were making changes in their behavior now that they had this awareness of the implicit biases that we all bring to our interactions in our work. There's a second intervention that's not yet been published that actually did a fair amount of training and department redesign at multi-levels, both redesigning promotion or various policies to promote family-friendly practices, and providing additional support to junior women that's had some initial success. So I think I'll stop there, and we can certainly have some further discussion about some of those findings.
Great, thank you. And next up, we have Dr. Hazel Siv. We'll pull up her slides. Hazel, are you here?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay,
Dr. Hazel Siv is a professor of biology at MIT, member of the Whitehead Institute for Biomedical Research, associate member of the Broad Institute, and a McVicker faculty fellow. She received the BSc honors from the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa, and the PhD from Rockefeller University. Her research focuses on neurodevelopment disorders, as well as fundamental processes underlying brain and craniofacial development using zebrafish and frog systems. Dr. Siv also focuses on education and training. She teaches introductory biology, developmental biology courses, and is former Associate Dean of Science with oversight for diversity in education. She led the 2011 report on the status of women in science at MIT and continues to promote gender equity. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here and to help discuss this very important set of topics. What I thought I would do is to give you a sense of, how are things at MIT and what's the view there with regard to women in science. And if I could have the next slide, please. And what I want to do is to discuss two things. I'll talk about some of the good news, of which there's plenty, and then focus on some of the challenges that Bob's excellent paper has raised and that Karen just raised in her talk as well. Next slide, please. Let's start with the good news. And if we look on the next slide, you'll see there's plenty of it. This is a graph of the number of women, the percentage of women in different groups at MIT. And you can see that over the past decades, the percentage of female undergraduates, graduate students, faculty in science and engineering have all been rising, and have all been rising at a steady pace. When I joined the faculty at MIT, there were 8% female faculty in the School of Science, and we're now around 20%. It's not 50%, but it's good news nonetheless. On the next slide is even more good news. The women who are on the MIT faculty are a powerhouse. They are an extraordinary set of colleagues. For some of them, just in the School of Science, amongst about 50 female science faculty, there is tremendous recent leadership. Our former president, Susan Hockfield, department heads, our present vice president for research, Maria Zuber, herself the recipient of the largest research grant ever awarded to an MIT faculty member, $400 million. I am a former associate dean for the School of Science. We have center heads, and we have many, many awardees, including these shown here on the slide, who have received the National Medal of Science. It is a great group. I like to say that if you are a woman at MIT in one of these groups, you've won. You've demonstrated your success in STEM. You should celebrate. You should be confident because you've really made it. And I think we tend to forget that a lot. We tend to focus on problems, which we need to do, but we also need to focus on the things that are triumphs. And this set of women and this increased trajectory of representation of women at MIT is really demonstration of the success of women in STEM. Next slide, please. And so here are some specific increases which really herald the increases of women faculty in some of the science departments. For example, in brain and cognitive sciences, the percentage of women has almost doubled in the past decade. In earth, atmospheric, and planetary sciences, it's almost trebled. And even in mathematics, long a bastion of men, the number of female faculty has more than doubled over the last 10 years. So these are all things that we can really be proud of. Next slide. Now, some years ago, in 1999, Nancy Hopkins and Molly Potter led a landmark study that pulled out some of the gender inequities that were present at MIT at the time. And I won't go through what they found and what happened, but suffice to say that many changes were put in place at MIT by an administration that was very responsive to understanding the inequities in gender equity at MIT at the time. Some years later, under my leadership, together with Lorna Gibson in the School of Engineering, the women faculty at MIT re-examined their status. And I want to point out a couple of key things that we found from this report, which, if you're interested, you can look at online. It's quite short and quite readable. So if we have the next slide. Really, one of the key things we found was that people felt very good about being at MIT. My experience has been that this is a fabulous place to work. And it's profound to have senior women in leadership roles, something else that we saw over and over again. There was a lot of positive, but I want to, in this very brief discussion now, and I think in the next slide, move on to the challenges. And let's start with some of the challenges that we saw from this report as it came out. Next slide, please. So here are some more faculty findings from our 2011 report. This perceived preferential treatment of women. As we go forward and make sure that recruitment of women faculty proceeds, that women feel welcome to apply for faculty positions, that we find all of the qualified women and say, hey, MIT is a good place for you, please apply. People are worried. I am very worried about making much effort to recruit women and the perception that women are therefore not as good. And self-doubt. I felt I was invited to interview because I was dazzling, but now I wonder. And then there was this question of expected behavior, which really resonated amongst the female faculty. There's an expectation of niceness, of sweetness, of really wanting to nurture and mentor you. But I am not patient and understanding. I'm busy and ambitious. And there was lots more there that really pointed out this kind of ambivalence of feeling confident, of feeling pleased with the atmosphere at MIT, the ability to do outstanding work, together with stereotypes that were really a pain in the neck to deal with. So next slide, please. And we can look at, a bit of the frustration here by looking at some of the departments where the percentage of female faculty really hasn't budged, that is somehow tied into the ability to recruit women and the ability to perhaps retain them at MIT, but I think it's more the recruiting thing. For example, in biology, the percentage of female faculty hasn't budged over the last decade. It's 25% or so, and it's just been sitting there. In chemistry, the same thing, and in physics, the same thing. Those departments are just sitting there, and I think in each case it's not for the lack of interest in recruiting women and trying to attract them to the department. So what's happening? And perhaps the next slide will enlighten us a little bit. What we can see when we look at the trajectory of students, of undergraduates, graduate students, and then women faculty, we can see that there's a real drop-off at different places along the educational trajectory. 70% of our undergraduates are female. By the time we get to graduate school, some of those women have gone off to medical school, but we are at about 50% or more female graduate students. But look, there's a drop-off, because by the time we go to hire female faculty, we get down to only half of the graduate student representation. Where did all those grad students go? Somehow they didn't go and do postdoctoral periods, or the postdocs decided then not to apply for faculty positions. We can see similar things in math, where there's a kind of a steady decline from a reasonable percentage of female undergraduates all the way to a percentage of female faculty. And in physics, again, there's a kind of a steady decline, especially between the undergraduate and the graduate level. So these tell us that there is a question of pipeline and raise the question of why are students not going on to enter the realms of female faculty at top academic institutions. So next slide. I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to, because it's a longer discussion than we have time for here, but what I am going to do is to go through some of the things that I think we need to work on and work on and work on to promote gender equity at MIT and beyond. And so we'll flip through a number of things. If we can just go through the first one. Okay. We need to promote fair faculty hiring procedures. When I was Associate Dean, I spent a lot of time putting in good faculty hiring procedures in the School of Science, and some of these remained in place when I stepped down to go on to other avenues, but we have to be careful that things don't go away. It's difficult to put procedures in place and have them perpetuated, have them institutionalized. Someone needs to be on top of making sure fair hiring procedures, fair startup packages, all of these things are in place and remain in place. Next one. We do at MIT monitor salary and space. Salary is monitored at a central level. Space is monitored at a more departmental or unit level. And there is a real awareness that female faculty as well as male should get fair salaries. And I think that that largely is true. Next, please. Dual career respondents for the survey we wrote said that dual careers were the hardest thing. They were harder than any research program. To keep a relationship together while two careers were struggling to develop was the hardest thing. And so we and many other universities are looking for ways to give two talented people the opportunity to be at least in a similar area of the country at the same time. Next. At MIT, we have a tenure clock extension that is automatic for women who give birth to a child, but can be easily granted to others who ask for an extension, including men. This is something that we are rephrasing or working to rephrase in terms of the more modern, the more recent kinds of families that there are. And of course, part and parcel of this, but not a female-specific need, he has made some strides in recent years. I have the next one. This is one, promoting gender equity in seminars and conferences. This has been quite an interesting thing. You know, you would think it would be really easy to make the number of women in seminar series, in conferences, representative of the number of women in the field or the percentage of women in a particular field. But it is extraordinary how, if someone is not watching, that slips. And all of a sudden you have an all-male conference, or 1 out of 15 speakers in a field that you know is well populated with female faculty really appears on the walls of elevators and so on. So that's another one that we really have to keep on. And then I think the last one on this particular page, and something that is really on the minds of many, women really get fewer opportunities on advisory boards and as consultants, and this is something to be pushing for in some way. It's a tough one, but it's one that we're very much aware of. And then I have a few more on the next slide. Let's go to this one. Educate on undervaluation. Karen talked about implicit bias, and I think that that's a very important aspect to educate on as well. I like the term undervaluation, though, that Joe Handelsman's group published in their very good paper in 2012. The notion that, you know, you just are not respecting women or valuing their capabilities in the same way that you would for a male colleague, that is something that is real, and it's unbelievably irritating at all levels, all the way from our undergraduates to our faculty. Next one. Promoting student and postdoc confidence. As I said, you know, I say to students and postdocs, you're here at MIT, you've won, you're women in STEM in a very prominent place. Have the confidence to see that. But of course, that's not how people see themselves often, and this notion of mentoring for success, I think, is really quite helpful all around. And next one. At MIT, we became aware as a number of campuses that sexual assault, especially for women students, was really a challenge to feeling comfortable, feeling confident on campus, and that's something that MIT really did address quite boldly last year. And then finally, my final point, you know, I think at the high level it's very important to be on top of gender equity and to be clear about giving female new faculty equals startup packages, making sure that there are programs in place to give tenure clock extensions, to give whatever is needed to promote the success of female faculty. But I've also become really aware recently that the new feminists are in place. The young women, the undergraduates, the graduates, the postdocs, they are the new feminists. They have a new view of things, and I feel that sometimes we don't listen to what is saying enough. And so I have started listening to what some of our group campus is saying, the undergraduate women in physics, for example, graduate women at MIT organization, and the postdocs have just put in place a new power group to give women at that particular level a voice and a say in their trajectory. And I feel that it's really extremely interesting and useful to listen to these groups. So that will conclude what I want to say to you. Let me acknowledge in the next couple of slides about some good news. Good news at MIT with regard to the number of women represented and their trajectory, and talked a bit about some challenges that we and many other universities face. I'd like to acknowledge our institutional research group, the many women faculty that I've worked with, and all of the postdocs and students as well. Thank you to Bob, and thank you to you all for listening. I would welcome some conversation about this.
Great. Thank you so much. I also just want to say thank you to our participants. We had a few technical difficulties, so thanks for bearing with us. And also just a reminder that we will have a few minutes for questions, so if we've been receiving a couple, if you'd like to submit any questions, we'll receive them on this end. Next up, we have Cindy Escobar-Alvarez. She's the Program Officer for Medical Research at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, a private foundation with a mission to improve the quality of people's lives through support of the performing arts, medical research, environmental conservation, and the prevention of child abuse and neglect. At DDCF, she manages the Clinical Scientist Development Award for Early Career Physician Scientists. She's also co-chair of the Early Career Scientist Working Group of the Health Research Alliance. The Health Research Alliance is a national consortium of over 60 non-governmental, nonprofit funders of biomedical research and training. She is a doctoral graduate of the Pharmacology Department of Cornell University Weill Graduate School and postgrad alumnus of Sloan Kettering Institute. Welcome.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you for the introduction and the invitation. So today I will go over funders' efforts and ours in particular to promote the retention and advancement of women in academic medicine, and in particular regarding early career investigators, as others in this webinar have mentioned and have shared that disparities already exist at this stage. Next slide, please. So briefly, non-governmental funders are strong supporters of early career investigators, and I'd like to show that here. So in 2012, a group of 42 of them dedicated 44% of their $866 million in funding to career development and training. So it's really important to capture the full potential of early career scientists by promoting female investigators. Next slide, please. So the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation is one of these funders that supports early career development through its Clinical Scientist Development Award for assistant professor physician scientists that are conducting clinical research. And some of the examples of what funders can do come from these awards programs. Next one. We know that career development award attainment associates with achievement of independent funding. So the first two bars here show applicants to our early career development award. And on the left are those that received the award, followed by the next runners-up that did not receive the award to the right. A higher percentage of successful than unsuccessful applicants received R01 research grants 4 years after the start of their grant. And a similar association on the right two bars was observed for recipients of K23 awards and those that applied but did not receive one. So we as funders would like to maximize the number of women that receive career development awards, for example. Next slide. Now, this can be done at 3 major steps of the review process that are shown here. Next one, please.
And a leading non-governmental funder that has addressed this issue is the New York Stem Cell Foundation that has gathered a working group and come up with 7 recommendations, mostly for funders to advance women in science, engineering, and medicine. And I encourage you to look at these 7 recommendations in this publication. Next slide, please. So, up to some examples, there are strategies that we have used at the Dorset Charitable Foundation at the application step. One is to encourage participation of female applicants by allowing institutions to nominate an additional candidate over the limit of 2. And we did this for a couple of years. We see a noticeable effect. So another approach that we have taken is in 2013, we opened the competition, and this is our Clinical Scientist Development Award, our Early Career Development Award. We opened the competition and eliminated nominations, so all eligible applicants could take part in the competition, thus removing any potential barriers to female participation. Another point is we also raise awareness during application process by asking information from the department chairs and the mentors of these applicants, such as the number and percent of mentees of female assistant professors, to really signal to the institutions that our foundation cares and is concerned about the advancement of women. And last, we also do so by collecting data to follow career trajectories. A challenge here really is incomplete data. That's always a limitation. For example, name disambiguation as well for women is a hurdle as this may change. And we tend to collect information that is relevant to the review process. And often, if we ask additional information, have found incomplete data really to be an issue. For example, of those that were asked for an ORCID ID in our past most recent competition, only about 24% provided one. So this information would be really important to follow career trajectories going forward. Next slide, please. In terms of a review step, we've worked to assemble a balanced review panel, a gendered balanced review panel, which is actually challenging as most senior investigators are male, and most so the pool itself that we can reach out to is already has an underrepresentation of female applicants, but we really try to address this. And the last 2 are also potential actions during the review process, but not 2 that we have undertaken at our foundation. One is to incorporate implicit bias statements, and the other one, blinding reviewers to gender, which could be challenging during a review for a career development award. Next slide, please. And last, at the STEP Award, we provide mentorship opportunities outside of the institution where our grantees can meet our Scientific Advisory Council members. 2 additional actions that we have not taken are changing policies on allowable costs and offering additional research funds or expenses of extra professional childcare responsibilities. About these last 2, as a private foundation, there are limitations set by the Internal Revenue Service on the use of funds for what could be considered personal expenses. So there are barriers that funder needs to explore more to make this possible. Now, despite all of these funders' actions, we know that female early career scientists still advance at slower pace than men. So the Dorset Charitable Foundation decided to take an additional step and to really try to address this issue at a bigger level or through an actual program. Next slide, please. And we recently launched and created a new program that is called the Fund to Retain Clinical Scientists. And these are grants of $540,000 each over 5 years. We just finished the review process, actually, and there are 10 institutions that will receive these awards to provide supplemental, flexible research funds to early career physician scientists working on clinical research projects and facing extra professional demands of childcare. So these are not funds for childcare, but for research and to really help those facing extra professional demands advance their careers. We received a very high response, about 62 proposals for these grants. So we are really excited and looking forward to tracking the outcomes in going forward. And with that, we can start the discussion, I guess. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So we will be starting a discussion here in just a minute. We did want to launch one poll just to see kind of, So we'll be launching this poll just to help have people, I guess, give us a little bit of information about how big of an issue you think this is now that you've heard from all of our presenters. So we'll give that just a minute. So the question is around women and men being afforded equal opportunities in biomedical research funding. Okay, it looks like 75% of us disagree that there are equal opportunities, with 16 or 17% believing that they strongly disagree about the equal opportunities. Okay, great. Thanks, and now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sege, who's going to lead us in a discussion.
First of all, I just want to start off by thanking our panelists, Dr. Siv, Dr. Freund, and is it Ms. or Dr.? Doctor, and Dr. Escobar from Doris Duke. Thank you so much for participating today and for your varying insights on this. I'd like to just start off the question and ask each of you a question that I've been asked several times since this paper came out. And so the first question is, where do you think we should go from here? I think that, like the audience in the webinar, we're also in agreement that it's not an even situation for men and women in science. So if I can just ask each of you to chime in and answer, where do you think we should go from here to address this issue?
Well, I'll start off. This is Karen Freund. And it's interesting, Hazel, I love the list of possible areas that are areas to work on. And when I sort of look at what level these really are having their impact, many of them seem to be at the institutional level. And I would sort of say, based on the experience at MIT and your description, is that the institutional level is really probably an area that's fruitful for sort of some early changes, some quick changes that could result in some real major impact. And I'd be interested in your thoughts as well as Cindy's thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is Hazel. I think, I think the institutional level is a really a terrific place to put things in place. I think, it's one of the places there might be some memory of good, good initiatives that are in place, and certainly if there's some central oversight, for example, with regard to salary and space as we have at MIT right now, that does allow a perpetuation and a kind of a centralized addressing of issues that really are feasible to address.
Hazel, I just want to pick up on that. You mentioned the central oversight of salary and space. Are you aware of any institutions that have central oversight for startup funds? Because my understanding is that that's an individual negotiation between each newly hired scientist and his department chair.
Yeah, I think that, I think you're right, Bob. I think that would be it would actually be silly in a way, because the amount of startup is different in different fields and even in different subfields. So, that would be a very tough thing to manage at a central level. However, I will tell you that we are looking right now across all of our startup packages, across gender and across different fields, to see whether or not there are disparities. And I think, there can be someone who gathers information from various places and takes a look. I think when it comes down to it, though, it's going to have to be the department head or the unit head that really is going to need to be aware of possible disparities and be on top of that. And I would say that is probably true in most of our departments and units right now. But as you suggest, that to monitor at an institutional level is difficult at the time of hiring. To monitor retrospectively is okay, but the people who are really on the ground offering the startup packages are the department and the unit heads, and they need to be the ones who really are on top of the situation as the startup packages are being offered.
And were any of you surprised by the results? The startup packages were so different, because I certainly was surprised at the degree of difference.
This is Karen. I'll say I was surprised at the degree of difference. I mean, this is not data from the 1990s. This is very recent data, and again, sort of demonstrates that we're not talking about something that was going on 20 years ago and that we fixed. I mean, this is really, inequities that are happening, right today. I think one of the challenges for clinical faculty in medical schools is that oftentimes the faculty are actually hired by hospitals and not by the schools, and oftentimes there are multiple different people doing the hiring. I think even within departments, oftentimes it's the division or section chiefs that are making the hires. But I do think that monitoring and having an active monitoring process in place in and of itself is an intervention. I think a lot of these inequities are unintentional and reflect people's biases that they weren't aware of, or all of our biases, and that the process of monitoring can have an impact in and of itself.
Thank you. And Cindy, we had a question that was typed in on the screen from one of the webinar viewers that's directed at you. You mentioned some of the issues in the review process, and do you think it's possible to mask reviewers as far as the applicant's gender? Because often that might be difficult, particularly if they're able to see the names of the applicants.
Right. Thank you for the question. So it is. I think it is very challenging. We haven't figured. I haven't figured out a way in which it could be done. Especially as I mentioned, career development awards, at least ours and many others, focus strongly on the potential of the individual, the past publication record, and all of these. Even if you mask the name, it is easily identifiable, right? So it is definitely a challenge where I think NSF might have worked in some blinded reviews, but I'm not aware of others that may have been done. But it's definitely a tough one.
And Cindy, I was very interested in the latest, the Doris Duke Awards for faculty retention. And are you planning to monitor the success of those, and what are you going to be looking at to see how that works? Sure.
So you're asking about evaluation.
Yeah.
So we are actually engaging with an external evaluator, so an independent evaluator, to hopefully look at the career trajectory, so the impact of these awards on those that receive it, compared to those, the design. I mean, it's not done yet, but we do hope to know that, as well as possibly the impact on the institution. So I thought it's interesting that it was brought up that we also recognize that the institution culture and there has to be some, there are changes. But what we think about as funders is there something that we can do, and certainly we hope through this award that we can help promote that change. Another aspect of sort of monitoring in terms of by funders that we have heard about, and that the main funder in the UK has implemented, actually, is a system that rates the how friendly the policies are at institutions to promote female faculty to the funding. So they have to have, and this is called the Athena Swan Charter. And again, this publication, one of the recommendations from your stem cell has been to create a report card. So where institutions get a certain grade for or a certain rating, for the commitment to advancement of women. And in the UK, at least, almost institutions have a minimum set of commitments to advancing careers of women. They're not even eligible for funding. So that's a consideration. It's something that funders here haven't done, but others have. There's a precedent for that.
Great, thank you, Cindy. So it's about 2 o'clock. I think we'll wrap up now. So thank you all for participating in today's webinar. Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Sege, Dr. Freud, Dr. Siv, and Dr. Escobar-Alvarez for providing us with some really valuable information today and helping us to further explore the issues of gender inequity in biomedical research funding. So to everyone on the call, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation. And as noted earlier, a recording of the webinar will be made available. Thank you all.
Thanks so much.